How do you translate a photo into a painting? My name's Lacey Walker. I'm the artist behind Rebel Unicorn Crafts, and today we're going to be talking about a beginner-friendly, that's kind of the mindset that I want to approach this from, is where would a beginner start with translating a actual photograph or something from real life to putting it on the page. And just in case you're having an impatient day, you can skip ahead to this timestamp here for when the actual tutorial starts. You might miss some good stuff, but I do almost always get a comment or two saying that I should get to the point faster. So anyways, if that's you and you need to move to that timestamp, feel free to do that. I have days like that too. But I do like to provide as much context as I possibly can in my videos, so that's usually why I have a little bit of an intro, because some people need the context, some people don't, and they just need to skip ahead. But what we're going to be discussing today is maybe even one step before having a reference photo. You can always look up reference photos. One of my favorite sites to find fun reference photos is Unsplash, and you can find the ones that are royalty-free so that you don't get in trouble for using them, which is make sure that you're not taking somebody's photo that you don't have permission to do so. So make sure you use something like Unsplash if you're just grabbing random references off. It's always better to just be safe than sorry, so I'd recommend going ahead and using something like that, or in instances like this, when I am providing you a tutorial, I will obviously provide you the reference photo. So if you want to be able to download this, in the caption below, I will put a link to where you can go to my website and download this photo itself, because yeah, this is meant to be used for this painting in case you need a bigger version of it. But here's the thing, is that sometimes you're going to find your own reference photo, or potentially it might actually be something from real life that you see that you want to put on your page. Now, for anybody who's been around here for enough time, you might have even seen this is the vase that I made specifically for sunflowers last year. There was something about it, just kind of this, it's actually a hand-built vase that I just kind of squished together, and I kept it very organic shaped. I really like it, and I knew that it was going to be perfect for sunflowers, and in my own opinion, which this is for me, so I guess that's the one that matters, I do think this is the perfect vase for sunflowers, and I just love it so much. But I do find, especially if you're a beginner, just trying to paint this as it is can be really overwhelming. Sometimes we do need to make sure that we just take a snapshot so that things are in place and we can really zoom in on specific areas without getting kind of confused by all of these things. So I do actually find sometimes that it's easier to, even if you're working from something that is in real life, to take a reference photo of it just so that your brain can simplify it. Because if you're brand new to watercolor, guess what? Trying to paint something from a photo is going to be a little bit tricky, and trying to paint something from real life can be even trickier. And in order to keep it a little less tricky, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is the angle that we put this. So what I did was I took this photo. The house we moved into has this brilliant orange wall, which I thought I was definitely going to paint over immediately, but it's kind of growing on me. And when I put this vase up against that, it just looks so beautiful. So that is where my reference photo is. The things that I want to keep in mind, though, is that when you take a reference photo, you can selectively edit out areas. So you can crop out parts of the bottom, you could crop out other things in the frame. By the way, this is a diagram of the Enterprise. And we can do things like ignore these cords, because I didn't have a perfect place to put this, but it did serve the purpose of giving me this nice, lovely orange background. And then I just get to edit out the things that I do or do not want to actually include in my painting. Now, the other consideration we want to think about is the angle at which we're taking this photo, because it's often really tempting to set your object down and then snap a picture, which is usually actually done at a bit of an extreme angle, either coming way down at that object or looking straight up at that object. And if I do this to this vase, I want you to notice something. If I go from way above, do you see how that changes the perspective of the vase to the flowers if it's above or below the actual middle line? And what that does is that's going to introduce us having to kind of figure out a bit of perspective, which could complicate things. If you're up for a challenge, go for it. However, if you're a beginner, and this is one of your first times doing this, I would recommend keeping this at eye level, because it's going to mean that we can kind of eliminate having to consider the perspective bit of it, which can be the challenging part. So make sure that when you are taking your photo, you're thinking about it being at eye level if you're not ready to tackle the perspective bit yet. And then the supplies that I used for today's video are going to be, this is my unicorn food set of watercolors, but you can use any set of watercolors for this. You don't have to have these specific ones. I will reference when I'm mixing up colors. I'll just be talking about yellows and oranges and things like that. So just use whatever your closest match is when you are trying to mix different colors up. I used a size 3 quill brush to paint this today. You don't have to have this exact brush. Again, this is my brand. But what I would recommend, especially if you're a beginner, is something like a size 10 or 12 round brush with synthetic bristles. You're gonna need some paper towels as well as 2 cups of water or 1 really big cup of water. I used some washi tape to get the nice crisp lines around my painting. I painted in my Big Ideas sketchbook, and this does actually have 100% cotton cold press watercolor paper in it. So my paper might work a little bit differently than yours. This is not necessarily a techniques type video, so if your results vary as far as the techniques and things, that's gonna be okay. What we're really focused is just kind of that translation of the subject onto the page. So whatever paper that you like using that's watercolor paper will be just fine for this. I also did use a binder clip to kind of secure my pages together because I find it just kind of helps keep things a little bit flatter as well as just in place. And then finally, I'm also using some Prismacolored pencils to add in some of the final details. This is one of the things that I really like mixed media art. It's one of my favorite types of art when you just look at something and you're like, oh wait, there's a crayon and there's a pen and a pencil and I love those little details. So I'm always drawn to adding on final details. But one of the other nice things about using colored pencils as a topper is that it will take a kind of beginner friendly and very loose painting that does not need to turn out perfect. And then you can add in some of these final touches and it just adds this level of polish, which will make you feel more accomplished. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles in creating art is making sure that you feel a little bit accomplished at the end and allowing yourself to add that bit of polish. So we are going to be using some colored pencils at the end of this to bring it all together. All right, it's time to get going. So grab your watercolors and give them a good spritz. And then I'm just going to walk you through how I turn this photo into a painting. So before I even start the painting, I'm going to be trying to set myself up for as much success as possible. And one of the ways that I like to do this is by making the cute little border that will be kind of revealed at the end. And I do this by just taping off the edges of my paper or the page on my sketchbook using some washi tape typically. I also like to use some masking tape. And just so you know, I always just pick the cheapest one. So masking tape, I will buy the bulk pack that's the cheapest. Same thing with washi tape. I don't even usually pick the designs. I just buy a cheap bulk pack because I think they make really nice, crisp lines. But I do this as a way to set myself up for success because I feel like as soon as you take that tape off, it makes the entire thing feel so much more polished. So if you want to kind of add a little almost extra credit point, I would recommend doing this as well. And then our next step is going to be creating some sort of a sketch because while you don't have to sketch things out before you're painting things, if you've never done anything like this before, or if this is just one of your first times trying to transfer something that's not straight from a tutorial from an image, you are going to want to create some sort of a map so that you know where you're kind of placing things so that once you get started painting, you don't get too lost. And you could go ahead and do a transfer sketch, but what I actually recommend doing is allowing yourself to be a little bit more flexible, and instead we're just going to focus on some of these main shapes. So for example, in this painting or this picture, we have 3 main centers of the sunflowers that we can see, and I'm going to just kind of roughly sketch those out. I have 2 that are more or less circles, and then 1 that's a big oval, and then I have this big spray of petals that's facing towards the back. My goal here is not to trace or draw every single line exactly as it appears on that photograph because we're not trying to do something super realistic here. We're trying to just kind of get the essence of this vase with these flowers into a watercolor painting. So what I'm going to instead focus on are just the important bits. We have the centers of the flowers where the big spray is. And then I want to also make sure that I do mark out where a few of those heart-shaped leaves are because they are pretty representative of what's going on, but I'm not going to try to draw every leaf in. I'm just kind of getting where the heart shapes are as well as kind of where those teardrop shapes are, and you know what, I can make some of these up. So if it feels too complicated, I can put a more simple one in. And then I'm just going to block out the general shape of that vase. And this is a very organic shape, so your lines don't have to be straight because of that organic shape. And as a matter of fact, we're painting stuff that's basically from nature, so nature is natural, and if you have some variation, that is totally fine. I want you to focus more on getting the feeling of the thing rather than representing the thing exactly. And then the next thing that you might want to address is those pencil lines. Now I am going to show you how to lighten these a little bit, but I am going to be keeping mine a little bit darker because that way you can actually see them. But I know a lot of people do not like having pencil lines in their finished piece shown through, and since we're going to be using some yellow, you might want to take the time to lighten these. I like to use a kneaded eraser. I just make sure it's nice and kneaded, and then you can just kind of tap on the surface to remove some of that graphite, or even roll it up so that you can roll it across the page to lighten it a little bit. Mine will show through at the very end, and I personally don't mind that very much, partially because you guys need to be able to still see to some degree what I'm doing, but also I don't mind pencil lines. You might have a different opinion on that, and that's totally fine. But it's officially time to start the painting, and what I'm going to do is I want to start with kind of a big win. As in, I want to put in some of that bright color so that I feel like I know where things are going. And I'm going to start by mixing up a yellowy color. I've put some water in one of my wells, and then I'm just going to be grabbing different yellows. I actually started with a little bit of kind of a yellowy orange in there. The color itself does not matter. What we want to focus a little bit more on is saturation. And that's why I have this tester strip here, because as I mix those colors in and then squiggle them around in that well, I do want to make sure I'm mixing up enough, because I'm going to be putting this kind of all around all of the different areas that we see those petals. So I need to be able to redip my brush a few different times. But I'm testing as I mix that in so that I can actually see that saturation, because the wells of your palette are going to kind of lie to you. They're going to look like a different color than when you actually put it on the paper. And I'm going to take a second to actually re-observe my reference photo here. Notice that there are different directions that these petals are going, and we can kind of keep that in mind. Some of them are going to go all the way around. Some of them are going to kind of have a flat side. That spray is all going to go in one direction. So we just want to think about the fact that we're not putting just those straight petals out on every single one of them, but our first layer isn't going to really matter. I want you to just kind of go in the general direction of those petals by putting some of that color in your brush, and then we're just kind of pressing down. We're doing some of those press and lift motions. If these strokes are not perfect, it's going to be fine. As a matter of fact, none of these strokes that you're going to put down today need to be perfect, because we're not perfect painters. We just like to paint. But notice that I'm trying to move my brush kind of in different directions as I do move around these, to at least kind of represent the direction that those petals would be going. If you have trouble with this and you need to, you can move your page around to help you. But we're kind of trying to just get a messy ring going for these of this base yellow color. We will be coming back in and adding in some additional layers. So these are going to get built up more and more, and you don't have to focus 100% on making every single stroke perfect. It's more about getting that edge, where that edge has some of the jaggedness to it, as well as both the inner and the outer edge. They both have a bit of jaggedness to them. We just needed to take the time to put in that first layer of petals all around those different areas that we kind of marked out. Remember, we made a map for ourselves, and now we just need to follow the map. I'm going to speed the rest of this bit up just a little bit so that we can continue on, because I'm just doing the same thing, making those petal shapes in the different directions that they're facing in that same color. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a little bit of that watercoloriness, where we can transition or have these variations in color, because it all flows together. And I'm going to do this, it's going to be subtle, but I'm going to do this by modifying that yellow that I started with. This is also where that tester strip comes in super handy, because it helps us keep track of the colors that we're using in our painting. So you can see where I ended the last color, And then as I make modifications to this, I'm trying to make it a little bit more orange and a little more saturated. Again, I'm kind of going for a little bit of subtlety here. You could go for a bigger jump if you wanted to, but then all I'm really doing is I'm going to add in a few more of these strokes, as well as just kind of drop it in a few places around this. I do not want total coverage of this, so depending on how wet your petals are, you might need to either wait a bit. Mine are wet, but they're not big puddles, so it's not going to completely flow everything together. But just see how I'm just getting a few different areas that have this now kind of a little bit more orangey color to them. And even though I wanted those previous ones to kind of bleed in a little bit, anything else I do to these petals, I am going to want them to stay more separate. So I don't want to continue working on those at this point because everything would just continue to bleed together. I want a little more definition. So rather than taking time for it to let it dry, I'm just going to actually work on a different area. And specifically, I want to work on adding in some of those shadows in a layer where I'm going to be kind of making that vase. Now, I'm not going to try to represent every single thing on this vase shape, but this does have some ridges on it, as well as in general, we want to kind of allow the outsides to fall back and there to be a little shadow at the bottom as well. And I like to shadow using things like blues and purples, but not necessarily the blue straight from the actual pan. So I've put some water in one of these wells, and then I'm alternating between adding in some different blue, and then I'm actually trying to mute this color down a little bit by just taking little tiny bits of this orange color, which is going to slowly kind of mute this color. You can use things like black, that's totally fine. And I even find if you're going to use black, if you also mix it into some blue, that helps give it a little bit more vibrancy. That's just my personal preference, but again, I'm doing this on the tester strip so I can kind of keep track, and then I'm going to put in a few of these lines where there are those sectional lines on the vase. And just in case at any point during this you've been like, but is the paper wet or dry? I always tell you if it is wet beforehand. My paper has been dry up until this point. And now I am going to, after I made those lines, wet my brush, tap it off, and then I'm just kind of softening those a little bit. So I'm wetting across those lines that I made, which is going to soften a little bit. And then since now that most of that base is wet, now I can take more of that color and kind of just tap it along the edges and occasionally tap my brush off. And I'm going to just kind of create some of these shadows along the edge of this now very lightly wet vase. I even went ahead and mixed in a little bit more black just to kind of up the shadowiness, I suppose, or add in a little more variation. Let's really push one of those edges as well as the bottom kind of into shadow and start actually trying to define where this shadow is going to be. I'm not actually going for where the shadow is in the reference photo here. Remember, we can edit things. We've already edited out other things that are not, that we don't want to feature from the reference photo, like the chords and the frame and things. So we can kind of edit this. I can just imagine these being lit from above instead of having to try to make the shadows on the wall, because that can be a little bit more complicated. My goal in this shadowing-ish phase is that since we're painting a white object, really all we're doing is painting the shadows on it. So we're not going to be grabbing white or anything. We're just going to be kind of emphasizing where that shadow underneath it would be, as well as adding some variation into some of those indent lines, just to kind of give it that shape that it has. And then at this point, I don't want different parts of this to bleed together, so of course I'm going to take some time to let this dry or make it dry. And then once it's dry, I want to add another layer of those petals on. And really any color that you put on, yellow's a little bit tricky because it is such a typically transparent as well as a light color. What I want to do though is I want to modify the yellow a little bit, but whatever color you do put over this, if it's on a completely dry layer, you will see some individual separation on those petals. So make sure that you, if you need to, you can practice some of those press and lifts, and then modify your yellow color to be a little bit more saturated. And again, remember that map we made and when we did observe those petal directions, and we want to add some of those in, especially in some of the areas where there were gaps in between. We're just kind of layering these in. Transferring an image onto the paper is all about kind of noticing the essence of things. And when you look at these sunflowers, look how thick and fluffy they are. They do have some defined parts, but most of it is just about these delicious layers of yellow. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're making these subtle changes. So even though as we add these in, the changes are subtle in there, but it does add this fullness and it does add a little bit of definition. And I just think it's really interesting to watch this change kind of subtly happen where as we build these layers up, even though you can't totally identify each individual layer, there are some parts of it that really do start to kind of add to that entire picture. And in this layer, I am being a little bit more careful about my press and lift petal shapes because they do stand out a little bit more. So if you want to make sure that you're doing a little better job on this layer, the first layer doesn't really matter all that much because we're just kind of creating that fullness. But this one, we do want some of these to kind of stand alone. So you might want to be a little more careful in this layer, but they don't need to be perfect at all. And again, we're back to thinking about how we represent the thing in the photo in the best way and without having to do realism, because that's really not what we're focused on, is that realistic part of this. But we do want to take some of the characteristics and transfer it over. For example, there are these areas that are this nice orangey color that just kind of pop up in a few different areas to create kind of that fullness and that variation. So I'm going to put a little bit of an orangey color that's a little more concentrated in my brush, and I'm going to be dropping this in, especially around that inner center part. And I am being strategic with how I'm dropping this in, and I'm kind of reading the paper. I'm looking to see where the petals that I just added are still a little bit wet so that they will bleed up into them a little bit, because that's going to create some of that just wonderful, magical watercoloriness. And that's where I'm choosing to actually drop those in. If you have a hard time figuring out where to put that in, hold up your paper to a light source so you can see the reflection so you can tell where it's still a little wet. And I honestly feel like those little observations like that are what really brings something to life. Look at how much depth that little tiny bit of orange really added to the whole thing. And then the next thing I want to do is start to, I'm working in these different sections so they're not touching while things are wet. So the next thing I'm going to be tackling is this wooden area at the bottom. So I put a little bit of brown in my brush. I tapped it off so that I can do dry brushing, and I just kind of drug it along to get this kind of interesting texture similar to a wood grain pattern. And I repeated this process a couple times, changing that color a little bit, sometimes going more towards black, and just allowing, this is the hard part, is you want to allow some of that white to show through. Even though this doesn't look great right now, we are going to paint over this, but it's going to kind of show through our final layer of paint. So it's kind of key to make sure that you do allow some of that to show through so that we can add that texture. And then again, I took the time to let this dry, or make it dry in my case, because we're going to be going back up in and touching into certain areas that might still be wet. And then once everything was more or less dry, I do think I left a few areas that weren't 100% dry, but that's okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to kind of finish off the flower parts of the sunflower by adding in those middle bits. And I'm going to be doing this by making a small but concentrated puddle of color here over on the left side. To do this, I dipped into all of my different browns as well as the black, and I just squiggled around until it was a nice dark color. And then I'm going to be filling in those insides of the sunflowers. Now, I'm both being careful and also not careful here, because if you actually look at the insides of these, they're not perfect circles, so we don't need to make beautiful, perfect, swooping lines. Instead, I want to kind of intentionally squiggle my brush tip in and out a little bit along the edges so that it has some of that jaggedness where those petals are actually touching into the center. And I added in that dark brown color over most of it, leaving a little space in the center. And then I re-dipped into some very concentrated black, put that right in the center, and then also right along the edges of that, because there is some variation on the insides of those sunflowers. And I repeated the same thing in the other interior sunflowers. Maybe you chose to have more, so you might have a few more or a few less to do. But I'm also going to be kind of trying to keep in mind the direction the flower is facing so that if it needs to be more oblong, that middle dark part, I will do that. And just repeating that basic same process, but just changing the shape a little bit. And then you've probably noticed this at this point, but I am being really strategic in the sections in which I'm working so that I know whether or not things are going to bleed together because I like to work usually in layers that are not going to mix into each other unless I'm doing it very intentionally. And sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of this middle brown part bleed into those petals, but it can get really out of control. So, since this is meant to be a beginner focused one, I don't want us to have to be really, really focused on how wet or how dry things are because that can get really nuanced. So, that's why I'm really focused on working in these areas in totally separate sections and then drying when I'm being strategic so that they aren't going to bleed together. So that's why I'm kind of intentionally doing that here. But once I do finish these center parts, they're not going to be touching anything else. So I don't have to take the time to dry them because nothing's going to butt up against them because they're kind of encased around in that yellow part and we're done painting the yellow. And at this point, we have been pretty close to representational on what we are seeing in the image and then what we're actually painting. However, leaves are almost always where it just, especially when I was first getting started, I would just think like, well, I guess I don't want to paint this anymore because it gets so complicated. You're trying to figure out the direction and the shadows and the layering, and it's a lot going on. So we're going to treat it like it's a lot going on instead of trying to paint each leaf individually because our focus here is kind of creating the vibes of this and not the exact thing exactly represented. I'm not trying to go for realism, and I recommend you try not to go for realism either, especially if you're just getting started or honestly, that most people who want to do watercolor, realism is not the reason they get into it. So let's let the watercolor do the watercolor things. I mention this specifically because we're not painting every single leaf individually. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to wet everywhere that there are leaves with this kind of light-ish green color. I've mixed up kind of an olivey green, but with a lot of water in it. And I'm going to be painting that into our map everywhere, making sure that it stays more or less wet because what we're going to be doing is then just dropping in some different green colors after we've kind of pre-wet it with this. You could do this with just water if you wanted to, but I used this light green color so it was easier for me to track where it was down on the paper as well as easier for you to see. But what I want you to have in the mindset of making these leaves or the greenery in this bouquet is not where is every single leaf. Instead, it's going to be about kind of carving out. So think of your green area as a blank marble block. Which areas are you going to change the color of to kind of push them back a little bit or even to possibly bring them forward? So adding a little bit of yellow along the edges might kind of help to indicate that it's flipped up a little bit. Where are you going to add those shadows in by changing that green a little bit more to be a bit darker, a little more concentrated, or if it's kind of a dark bluey color that's going to really be in shadow? Just constantly change. The colors don't have to be the perfect colors that you see over there. What we're really focused on is changing the saturation level. So some instances it's going to be a little more saturated, or in instances like right here where I'm really trying to kind of carve out some of those shadows, those two leaves that are stacked that I did make sure to map out, I'm going to be dropping in much more concentrated colors there. And this is going to slowly start to kind of build these up. This doesn't need to be perfect. This is also one of those steps where I'm going to encourage you to, the moment that you think, is that enough? It's probably enough. The more that you mess with this at a certain point, the more muddy it's going to get. We want this to stay just kind of wet. We don't want it to just drop tons in. If at a certain point you've got it way too wet, things are bleeding together, just stop because we do have another step that we're going to be able to kind of re-enhance this area. And honestly, I would rather you had some of the fun, magical watercolor effects, including some of those back runs and things like that, than just homogenizing everything entirely and working at the perfect wetness. But if you are trying to do this, work at kind of that satin stage of wetness and then carve out those different areas. It's definitely not perfect, but it is so much easier than trying to paint every single leaf. And at this point, the bottom part of my painting is definitely dry. So remember how I said your bottom part doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to be layering on top of it. So I did a more wet mixture of kind of a brown color, and then I'm just painting that in over that dry brushing that I did, and you can still see some of that texture through it, and that's exactly what I wanted. The other thing I want you to notice in all of this is how much I'm kind of breaking down every section. I'm treating each section of this picture as a different task, and sometimes that is broken up into subtasks, and that's really the key to trying to make a more representational painting, even if it's not a perfect representation of it, is when you look at the entire image all at once, it can be very overwhelming. But if we break it into, I'm painting the petals. Oh, now I'm painting the shadows. Now I'm painting the general leaf shapes. Now I'm painting the texture for the table. It all kind of helps things come together and it makes it feel like more bite-sized and manageable tasks. And guess what? If you made it to this point, we are done with the majority of this painting. We have completed what we're going to be painting on for the sunflowers, the leaves, the vase, and the base. You could stop at this point if you're like, whew, that was a lot. That's good enough. That's totally fine. We are going to be adding in some topping details, and I want you to see that at the end, but I am going to take some time to make this background, although I'm going to add in a little something extra, but I encourage you to make your own decisions about the background. If you decide you want to make it a different color or a different pattern or a different texture, go for it. Remember, we're not trying to paint realism in this. We are trying to just paint something. And we're trying to also maybe embrace some of the watercoloriness. So if you wanted to change the colors and just kind of go for some wild colors, I'm going to keep it that orange because I thought it was kind of fun. And I mixed up a nice kind of light orange color to do this because while I love that really deep orange color, I want to be able to do some dropping in where I get these little spots that kind of bloom out. And I want it to be monochromatic. So I want to be able to have a more saturated orange color. So I need to have that contrast where I have that lighter color. Notice I'm working in sections here. So I get an area wetted. And then while it's still wet before I move on, I am going to just add in some of those drops. And look how cute those are. The other thing I want you to notice is that I had worked on that upside down and I left a little bit of a puddle at the very top part, which was the bottom part until I turned it around. And that's so that I can continue to move this around. And I'm not going to get any harsh lines on the edges because if I leave that puddle of water, it's going to kind of flow with me as I move things around. And that's what I encourage you to do as you're working on your background. Move your paper around so that you can manage that flow of water, but also you can manage the direction that your brush needs to face. For example, when I'm trying to work around these sunflowers, while I'm not going for a perfect matchup of getting into every single one of those petals, it's so much easier for me to get into those areas between the petals because of the direction I have my paper facing, because my brush kind of easily slots in there. So do yourself a favor, and when you're working on something like this, don't tape it directly to your table that you're not going to be able to move around. You're going to want to either work in a sketchbook, on a sketchbook, or you can even just grab a scrap piece of cardboard from your next delivery and tape it to that so that you can move it around when you want to do things like backgrounds or, well, really any part of the painting that would be easier if you could move the paper. And I'm going to speed up the rest of this background process because all I'm really doing is the same thing over and over again, where I'm going to take a chunk of the background, change the direction that I am moving my paper around, put some of that slightly lighter orange color. It does change a little in variation as it goes. And then once I get to a big section of that wet area before it starts to dry, I'm going to put more concentrated orange in my brush and drop that in to create those fun little kind of blossoms of color, and just filling in the entire thing until I feel like I've added in all the little dots that I wanted to. And the other thing I want to note is that if you don't touch completely to your painting, that's totally fine. If it overlaps in some areas, that's also fine. Backgrounds can be scary, so don't hold yourself to a perfect standard. I tend to actually like to kind of not quite touch in a lot of areas, but I get a little bit of both. And I really like the background that I put in on this and how I changed the color a little bit, but also the texture. And that's also one of the reasons why I really want to suggest that you don't always focus specifically on realism or copying exactly what you see. You can always make these different choices so that it becomes a little more watercolory or a little more to your taste so that you can have some fun exploring. Now, before we add our finishing touches, again, you could be done at this point, but I am going to add some colored pencil. And while you can actually draw colored pencil onto wet paper, it is more prone to damaging it. So I am going to take some time to dry this nice and thoroughly so that I can have a better chance of getting some really good lines on top of my painting that I made. And then I grabbed an assortment of colored pencils. I've got a couple greens here. I've got an indigo, which is probably my preferred instead of using black. And then I have a few different yellows and oranges. And I'm just going to draw some of these shapes in just to add a little more definition. Again, these aren't going to be like, wow, oh my gosh, you drew that here. It's going to be really subtle. It's going to be all in the details. And again, that's my favorite type of art is when you look at it really close, you start to notice these things. So that's kind of what I'm adding in here. I'm going to focus on adding some definition to some of the shapes, maybe darkening some of the areas, like the areas where the center parts of the sunflowers touch into those petals. I can take one of my darker brown colors and scribble around the edges to just kind of give it a little more definition if I feel like it needs it. And I can also take these to further define the leaves in this. This is where we can start to maybe look at individual leaves if we feel like we need to redefine things. But the other thing I really like about colored pencils is that they are actually opaque, or a lot of the colors are, so we can layer them on top. And that is one of the really key things is when we are painting in watercolor, a lot of times what we're really trying to do to get those highlights and things is avoid areas. And you know what's really hard to do, especially when you're just getting started? Avoiding areas. It feels very counterintuitive. And so this is going to enable us, instead of having to plan from the very, very beginning where every single vein on these leaves are going to be, we can instead use something like one of these opaque colored pencils, or you could come back in with a white gel pen or something. I'm trying to keep this a little more limited in supplies, so I did not include that. But you can come back in and add that on top. And it allows us to have these highlighted areas without that having to have that forethought, because I really believe that it's so important to learning as well as, in a lot of cases, just creating. You need to create something. But I don't want you to end a session where you've taken the time to create just feeling defeated because of one little mistake you made or the missed foresight to actually leave those areas white. We can always use these tools to kind of add those things back in to further define and just bring things all together so that you don't have to feel bad about it at the very end. I want you to feel really good about things. Even if yours does not look like mine, it should look like yours. That's a good thing. But I want you to have these opportunities to kind of bring things out instead of feeling like, oh no, it's ruined because I didn't do this one thing. There's always another solution that you can apply to kind of bring things back around. And I want to encourage you to do some of that creative troubleshooting. Is there a part that's bothering you that you want to be darker or lighter, or that you want to add in some of those details? Go for it. Use some other supplies and just see what happens. Okay, and then do you remember what I said about the borders adding that extra credit point? Just look at how much cuter it gets when I take that tape off. The tape was cute, but look at how much polish that adds when I remove that. Having that just crisp border is always extra credit points, and that's how you take a photo and turn it into a painting. I'm so glad you joined me for today's tutorial. I hope you had a ton of fun. Let me know how you did in the comments. One of the reasons why I wanted to even do this topic is that I find that sometimes trying to translate a photo onto the page, especially for beginners, and I say this because I know it, because I've seen it in real life and I've also experienced it when I started, but also even now. One of the things that I think is kind of funny is that people are attracted to watercolor because of its flowiness and kind of abstract interpretations and these intangible things. However, when we sit down and we try to translate an actual photo into a painting, suddenly we're trying to represent it like realism. And I say this because, again, I do this all the time. I go in with the idea of having this kind of loose, beautiful style where I allow the watercolor to do the thing that I want it to do. But then I find myself sitting down and thinking, is this the exact green that's in that photo? So what I want you to do is don't worry if your painting does not look exactly like mine. I want you to just to think about kind of transferring the essence of the photo. Where would you even begin to actually start to transfer this over? That's more what we're talking about, and that's why I did some of these looser things in here so that we're able to allow some of those watercolory things to happen without having to sit down and paint every painstaking brushstroke absolutely perfectly and have this perfect representation. Don't get me wrong, I do think realism is very beautiful, and there are people who can paint watercolor in a realistic way. But I don't think that that's the main attraction of watercolor. I think a lot of people come to it because they want more of that looseness and they want some of that magic that watercolor does on its own. So in a painting like this, I do want you to embrace some of those spots where you have backgrounds or cauliflowers or some of the fun things that just happen in watercolor. This does not need to be perfect. I want you just to have fun with it and allow a little bit of this to do its own thing. You should be so proud of yourself for taking some time to be creatively curious today. I hope that you have an absolutely great day, and I also hope you have a really good snack. And if you are a patron, please post your results in the Discord. I can't wait to see what you painted. That's one of the fun things about the Patreon is we have a private Discord community where we talk about what we're painting and art supplies, and oh man, the members are just, they're so supportive of each other and they constantly inspire each other, and I love seeing it. It's my favorite place.